Hey folks, Brandon Villarolo here with another episode of The Register Kettle, and with me this week is senior reporter Tom Claburn and systems editor Tobias Mann to chat about, hey, what else? AI. Specifically, we're going to be talking about, we're taking a look at Tom's piece from this past week about the seeming failure of persona-based prompting for the one thing AI seems to be reasonably good at right now, and that's coding. Gentlemen, welcome.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Hey.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think this is one of those topics we could probably go on about for quite a while. So,
yeah,
hopefully
yeah. I
we
mean,
can keep this on scope.
yeah, that paper I thought was very interesting. In the sense that there's so much sort of folklore out there about how to sort of prompt your model, and everyone has their own, set of recommendations and configurations. But one of the strong themes you get for over the past couple of years is that telling a model to behave in a certain way, giving it a persona or a role, is very effective. And
Yeah, you're a developer, you're a philosopher, you're a whatever kind of
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
exactly. You're an expert expert, web developer, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And what these the sort of past research on that has been, sort of back and forth. In some ways, it's been helpful. In some ways, it hasn't. And so these researchers set out to to just take a closer look at that. And what they found is that the the aspect of roles is helpful in the context of safety. So if you give it a role like an expert whatever or teacher, it will skew the model toward a little bit safer behavior, which
Mhm.
because of the sort of text associations it has with those roles, those tend to be, safer. I mean, if you're telling something you're an expert web developer, you're not, sort of a crazy anarchist or whatever the opposing role would be. Um,
Right,
you're
right.
going to get
But if you say you're a safety expert or whatever, like you said in the article, alignment dependent tasks,
right, right.
those
So
tend to be
yeah,
worse.
anything that sort of supports the sort of notion of it behaving properly is can be helped by that. But
Mhm.
where it turns out not to be helpful is for things that are fact based and really rely on the training data. And if you have a model that has been trained well and is knows a certain kind of coding style, just asking it for that is your best result, because if you tell it to behave in a certain way and give it a role, it may be, whatever pathways it takes to arrive at that output are less likely to happen. So you end up degrading the quality of the sort of fact-based output. I mean,
So
to
why
tell
why is that? Because I mean, I think in the article you touched on it, something about the expertise that if you kind of tell them you're an expert in this thing, it constrains the way the model will access training data in some way. So how, like, why? Do you know how or why that
well, I
is?
mean, it's I mean, I think part of the problem is the misconception that when you tell something it's an expert, it makes it better at something. But, you
Right,
don't actually add any training data to the model. It's all there to begin with, and by giving it a persona, you're just kind of, biasing its output paths,
right,
and, you're doing so in a way that makes it less likely to find the sort of factually correct thing that you've asked for if it's a, mathematically based thing. If it's a safety-based thing, you know, a lot of that stuff gets associated in the same sort of n-dimensional space in the model, and it's more
right.
likely to come out and be, behave in a way that's, "Oh, that's safe." But
So yeah, I think it's important to understand a little bit about how these models go about generating their outputs. It's a
Mhm.
probabilistic system,
Right,
uh,
right. Math
and
in, math out, tokenization, and yeah, yeah.
right. And so when for each token generated, it recalculates this attention where it figures out what is the most probable next token in that sequence. And so how that probability is skewed is influenced heavily by the input. So if you start by telling it it's a expert, you are going to change how the probabilities work in determining what the next token is, and so on and so forth.
Right, and I'm assuming in some way that may not be as predictable as you would think.
Well,
Clearly, right?
it's a
Yeah.
probabilistic system.
Right, right.
Non-determinism is a fact of life.
Yeah,
But
I mean, how many times can you give an AI the same question and it gives you a different response, right? That's pretty common, I feel like.
yeah.
well, I'm so not to go too deep in the weeds here, but like that there's some misconception there. So like you can seed these models so that every time you give it the same input, you will get the same output.
Okay.
Um, because you can fix the probabilities to some extent, However, that is not necessarily desirable behavior. And so we use mechanisms like temperature rather than using fixed seeds so that you can control the kind of how deterministic, how fuzzy that determinism is. Um, However, in the context of coding, we also have this other kind of backend component of this, which is the code either runs or it doesn't, or it compiles or it doesn't. So you can form a loop where, um, in an agentic sense, you have the model generate code, it checks that the code actually runs, and then, it tries again.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Which can
Um,
get very expensive if or you know,
right.
having it, bang its head against the wall a lot.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess in that story of yours, Tom, it seemed like
Mm.
the solution was those granular kind of expertises, or not even, or just sort of like giving it granular instructions, like just build this thing in Python or build this thing in Rust or whatever it happens to have knowledge in, and not trying to bias its responses in one way or the other toward a certain
Right.
expertise.
I mean, there are a lot of, best practices you can do in terms of, like, giving the model access to documentation and things that
Hmm.
will, help it find its way toward the kind of output that you want. And, people do that a lot in terms of, like, with Claude, for example, you write a skill, which is essentially just, access to files that it
Right.
has, when it's doing its inference.
And there's
So
no need to, once it's in that LLM's,
right.
knowledge bank, there's no need to bias it toward that, I guess, at that point.
Yeah, exactly, and,
Yeah.
hopefully your model will be good enough to find that, and, it's a hard challenge to deal with because a lot of times these models, you want them, they'll do really remarkable things, and then sometimes they do really stupid things, and just, it's just the probabilities are, you're rolling the dice every time, and, um, sometimes, it's the way you've phrase the prompt, and sometimes it's just, the model just is off on the wrong foot, and you have to correct it or start again. A lot of times it comes with a lot of context built in. So, like, if this is a continuing conversation, it's different from doing it as a fresh prompt. It's there's just a lot of things that you can't see. So it's easy to build up kind of a mysticism about how to interact with these things.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
A big emphasis that kind of started at the end of last year was this idea of spec-based code assistance, where your initial step is to provide basically just a markdown file that's fed into the model that describes what you want to build, and you try to think out through all of the features that you're trying to incorporate, all of the design decisions that you're making, just like you would if you were trying to do like clean room engineering on a product. You would have somebody look at the product, write up a perfect spec for it, and then have somebody else implement it, which is a whole other nightmare around code, vibe coding, by the way. You know, but not one for today. But
Yeah.
this is an idea that Amazon embraced with its Kiro code assistant, where you root it in this kind of spec document that you've written up, so that when the model has to make decisions where it doesn't have enough information in terms of what to do, it doesn't necessarily have to come back for clarification and hope that your answer actually tells it what it needs. It has that kind of you know root of trust or source of truth document that I can go back to as
Hmm.
kind of like a decision tree. Is like, oh, okay, so we're going to do all of these other things too, so that's going to influence what it does in order to address that problem, rather than coming back, hey, here are some options, none of which might be appropriate.
Right. Right. So I guess, looking at these kind of limitations, or just kind of things, considerations to make when you're considering trying to build something with AI or use it for coding. I mean, what, when we look at the limitations like Tom explained in the story, and Tobias, like you're mentioning right now, what does this mean for broader AI software development, right? Is this, you know, are we still not at the point where, because right, Claude Code has become really good, right? It's improved immensely in the past few iterations. I know I've heard a lot of people say that it is doing phenomenal jobs now with a lot of things. So AI is getting there, right? It's better than it has been. But are we looking at a limitation here? Are we looking at how limited are these things right now? Are they going to be? Is there any possibility that these can look like a thorough, comprehensive, skilled developer, or are they better for writing scripts? Where are we at, kind of?
Yeah, I mean, it's very use case dependent. I mean, I think it was around November people started noticing that these models were getting a lot better, and past couple of months, everyone has gone from looking at them as to being sort of hapless and error prone to competent a lot of the time, and people have been. I mean, a ton more code has been generated. I mean, just I think there was. I was looking at the other day something like 30 billion lines of code have been added in the past couple months to GitHub from just from Claude. And
Mhm.
what because these things are pretty good a lot of the time, it shifts the work from sort of spending a lot of time on like how I do this to what do I want to ask it, and did it produce what I asked for, and am I asking the right questions? So it kind of it shifts a lot of the work. I mean, I've been experimenting with building a web-based RSS sort of app to replace a desktop one that I'd written in Electron. I thought, well, maybe I can do it as a web app, and I actually don't really know web development so well that I spend a lot of time with Redis and databases. But I know a little bit about that, so I have been using Claude to spin that up, and it's been able to help me do things that I wouldn't otherwise. I would have to spend a lot of time doing. But at the same time, it makes a lot of just amateurish mistakes. Like, at one point I
Right.
did a path like, okay, now let's, do a security audit of this app. And it's like, oh yeah, I should put some, CORS, you know, controls in here because all of the API routes were not protected. It's like,
Right.
well, you wouldn't do that in the outset. It's like, but so it'll do a lot of things and then it'll just forget about stuff, or you know, it'll just change something and you won't know why it failed. And it's like, oh yes, I overwrote that or whatever. And so you spend maybe the same amount of time, but it's focusing on different things. It's a lot of
Right.
catching mistakes. And
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, what you were saying earlier, that basically it creates a lot
yeah,
of code fast, but it requires a lot more maintenance and oversight, which
yeah,
kind of, I think, brings us to, one of the big problems that, Tobias, you've pointed out before about vibe coding, right? Is that you're gonna run into a wall at some point, right? Like, no
Right.
matter, if you're not a developer, if you're using this to do stuff for you instead of learning to code, then you're gonna hit a wall where you're not gonna be able to get past the problems that it's gonna leave in its wake.
Right. I mean, s- programming is kind of a language for software engineering.
Mhm.
And, while these kinds of tools can help automate a lot of that work and help you get to where you're trying to go, if you are trying to address a novel problem that hasn't been, that isn't in the training corpus already, you're going to reach a point where you have to solve a real engineering problem. And
Right.
you know, you're going to run, and I'm sure Tom, you've run into this too, where you reach a point where it just keeps looping back through the same set of solutions that don't work.
yeah,
And unless you know what you're doing and have some sense, you can read the code, debug it, and kind of write a novel solution to that engineering problem, you're going to hit a wall.
Right.
And so I can see this as being a really powerful tool for helping developers spend more time on those kind of hard engineering problems. But you still need software engineers to actually solve those problems.
yeah.
Right. But do you think this is gonna, excuse me, are we good enough at the point now where a team of 5 software engineers could be whittled down to 2 or 3 guys who are just there to handle the advanced stuff? Or are we not there yet?
I mean, I think you end up producing more code and you have to maintain it. And I,
Mhm.
I don't know that you're going to get a labor savings ultimately because you spend your time doing other stuff. And the at least for me, what I found with this is if when spend my time doing, sort of trying to code this app, I'm doing a ton of just iteration on it, and it'll, it's like do it and then correct it and then test it, and like, oh, that's not doing what I want, and then correct it again, and it's like, well, I mean, is it any better than if I had just done everything by hand? It's a different process. I mean, it
Mhm.
is really helpful for things like looking up obscure command line. It's like, oh yeah, what's the flag for that? And it's if you're thinking like of a long Docker command, it'll help you pull that out faster than you could find it if you were, Googling or checking the documentation for it.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's definitely utility. It's just it changes the way you work. I don't know that it really. accelerates it that much. It just kind of, forces you to focus on different things.
What about entry level coders though, right? Because I feel like as we're discussing this, right, we're just talking about a lot of automation of entry level development work, and I know that's been a concern in the past with AI, right? Like you're going to have this kind of like period where you have a dearth of entry level developers who've kind of been chased away by the fact that their jobs are being automated. And then you're left with no experienced devs a few years down the road who can actually do the hard engineering that needs to be done on the back of these tools.
Yeah, and I think there is a risk that, because these tools require a lot of babysitting, you're not gonna be spending as much time learning the underlying concepts. I mean, there's certainly an opportunity to use these to, discover stuff and, "Oh, that's how you do this in Linux," or, "That's how you write this algorithm." But if you're not actively sort of then reinforcing that with, just sound learning practices, you're always gonna remain dependent upon this tool, and anytime that tool is not available, you're gonna be, pretty helpless.
Right.
As a counterpoint, I would point out, there's an opportunity here that when you start learning these concepts, and you start or building, something that outside of a toy designed to illustrate those concepts, you run into a situation where you have to do a lot of work in order to get to the real interesting engineering problems that will help you stand out. uh, you know, and so I can see a scenario in which these kinds of tools help folks spend more time on the hard problems, learn how to solve the hard problems, and spend less time on the cruft that has to be built, all the frameworking and all of that. The counterpoint to that is that it is incredibly helpful to have a mental picture of the framework of that you're building around these functions. And sometimes, at least in my experience playing with these things, I have to go back, stop, and go and examine what the heck it's built and why it's doing things the way that it's doing, because I've lost sight of the mental map of what it's doing.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
in that way, like, there's only so much acceleration you can do. I mean, a lot of people just seem to want to put these things on open claw and let them run and, come back and, profit. And, that's, I think, kind of overselling it. I think that there are ways to use these tools that are effective, but they don't necessarily, really change the, rate at which humans can process information and can, participate in the process.
Yeah, no, totally. I see what you guys are saying. So what's the kind of I mean, I guess, not to boil it down to a simple kind of conclusion, but I mean, what's the verdict here on, the current state of AI coding tools if we had to say based on this discussion? Are we looking at a place where we're, you know, uh don't get too dependent on them? Don't rely on them? Like what's the I don't know, what's the take? Like what how should developers proceed to interact with these tools?
Well, I mean, legally, it seems like they're gonna be around for a while. I mean, there hasn't
Yeah.
been any and none of the lawsuits have, really shaken this, made this stuff illegal. So it's
Mhm.
clear that this is gonna remain here for a while. Even if the US companies fold, there are Chinese companies who are doing it, who are gonna keep this stuff around. So it looks like, this is gonna be a reality for a while, and I think that people will just have to adapt how they work with them to do it efficiently if they wanna use them. I mean, there will still be a place for, human custom computer science and algorithm discovery. But, there's a lot of stuff you can do in terms of like automated vulnerability scanning and things like that, where these things are really useful and
Mhm.
they'll find a place. It's just the workflows for the people, how you arrange your people around these models and how they interface with them are still being developed. And
Right.
that's going to tell you sort of ultimately what the productivity picture is like. If you can really get away with, you know, a tenth of the engineering staff. I suspect you can't.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would
so
agree with
so far
Tom.
we've seen good things, but nothing's been proven absolutely. Tobias, what were you gonna say?
I would agree with Tom. You're still going to need engineers, and I don't know that you're going to need fewer of them. I don't. I think going back to the Microsoft Office example, it changed what people did, but it didn't necessarily reduce the number of people. It just
Right.
increased the amount of work as a whole that you could do. But
Mhm.
you know, yeah, it's hard to say. I know that a lot of folks want these things to be create a situation where they can reduce payroll and make savings that way. I don't think we're at a point where that's true yet anyway. And maybe that will change, but I think right now trying to predict the future and given what we've seen over the last 4 years is a dubious
Yeah, this stuff
idea.
moves so quickly, right? And so unpredictably, I feel like, 1 minute you're like, this can't do that. And then a week later, someone proves, yeah, we actually can do that and we can do it pretty darn well. So we will have to just wait and see what happens. But for now, I guess just a good way to squeeze more productivity out of underpaid and overworked developers. All right, guys. Well, thanks for coming in and talking about this. And we will see you next week for another episode of The Kettle.